A child's red mitten was tied to a broken fence post 3 miles from the nearest house. It was the only spot of color left in the storm. Below it, half buried in a white drift, lay a freight wagon with one wheel split clean through. A young mother crouched beneath the tilted canvas, holding a baby against her chest while 2 older children fought to keep their eyes open. The sun was already gone, the temperature was falling, and the mountain wind had begun to erase the last tracks leading back to the road. Then a lantern appeared in the snow. Not a rescue party, not a sheriff. Just one quiet cattleman on a tired bay horse. He climbed down, looked at the broken wagon, then at the children. The mother raised a frozen hatchet in both hands. The stranger did not reach for his gun. He removed his hat, lowered his eyes, and said 4 words. "My door is open." Before spring, those 4 words would become a promise repeated from ranch to ranch across an entire valley. But on that night, they were only a choice made by a man who had spent 6 years trying not to need anyone, and a woman who would rather freeze than be treated like a burden. The winter of 1889 arrived early in the San Juan high country. By the first week of December, every ridge above Mercy Pass was buried beneath snow deep enough to swallow a horse to the chest. The telegraph line to Silver Junction had snapped in 2 places. The stage route had closed. Even the mail rider had turned back after finding a mule frozen beside the North Cut. People who lived in those mountains understood winter. They stored beans in barrels, salt pork in stone crocks, and firewood beneath lean-tos close enough to reach during a whiteout. Travelers did not always understand. Nora Hale had come from the plains. She was 34 years old, widowed, and carrying everything she still owned in one narrow freight wagon. Her husband, Samuel, had been a carpenter in Dodge City. He had not died in a gunfight or a saloon brawl. There was nothing dramatic about it. A scaffold board split beneath his feet while he was repairing a grain warehouse. By sunset, Nora was sitting beside a cot with his blood drying on her sleeve. The warehouse owner paid for the burial. Then he charged her for the broken lumber. Within 6 months, the landlord had taken the house, the tools had been sold, and every person who had once called Samuel dependable suddenly had a reason they could not hire his widow. So Nora packed a sewing box, 2 iron pans, 1 feather mattress, 3 winter coats, and a small wooden chest containing Samuel's carpenter square and account book. She promised her children they were going west to a place where work mattered more than reputation. Ruth, 10 years old, believed her. Caleb, 7, tried to. Little Annie was only 11 months old and believed whatever face her mother showed her. For 12 days, the journey had gone well. Then the first storm closed the road behind them. The second storm killed one of their mules. The third came before noon with no warning at all. A gust struck the wagon sideways. The right rear wheel hit a buried stone. The hub shattered. The wagon rolled into a shallow ditch and lodged against a fence post left from an abandoned pasture. Nora used a strip from her red wool scarf to tie Ruth's mitten high on the post. "If anyone comes," she said, "they'll see the red." But by dusk, the mitten had turned stiff with ice. No one came. Nora fed the children the last heel of bread cut into 3 pieces. She told them she had already eaten. Ruth knew it was a lie. Caleb pretended not to. When Annie began to cry, Nora wrapped the baby inside Samuel's old coat and held her beneath the canvas while the wind shoved snow through every tear. "Are we going to die here?" Caleb whispered. Nora wanted to say no. Instead, she pressed her forehead to his and said, "Not while I can still stand." Then she stepped into the storm with the hatchet, searching for fence rails she could burn. She found 2 rotten boards before the wind turned her around. That was when she saw the lantern. It moved slowly through the white darkness, disappearing, reappearing, then growing brighter. A horse emerged first, then a broad-shouldered man in a dark buffalo coat, his beard rimmed with ice. His name was Elias Mercer. He owned nearly 800 acres in the valley below Mercy Pass. Though most people in Silver Junction would have told you that owning land was the only thing Elias did with other human beings, he came to town twice a month. He bought coffee, nails, lamp oil, and salt. He spoke when spoken to. He left before noon. 6 years earlier, scarlet fever had taken his wife, Lydia, and their 5-year-old daughter within 4 days of each other. After the funerals, Elias dismissed his hired men, shuttered the bunkhouse, and learned to run the cattle with only one Mexican vaquero named Tomas Ortega, who lived with his own family 3 miles downstream. People said grief had made Elias proud. Tomas knew better. Grief had made him afraid of warmth. Warmth could be lost, so Elias kept his cabin clean, his barn repaired, and every room as silent as the graveyard behind the chapel. That afternoon he had ridden to check a line shack before the storm sealed the North Range. On the way home, his horse shied at something flapping above the snow, a red mitten. Elias followed the fence line and found the wagon. Now Nora stood between him and her children, gripping the hatchet although her hands were too numb to hold it steady. "Don't come closer," she said. Elias stopped. "I won't. We have nothing worth taking. I can see that." The words sounded harsher than he meant them to. Nora lifted the hatchet higher. Elias slowly unfastened the gun belt beneath his coat and laid it in the snow. Then he set down the lantern. "I'm not here to rob you, ma'am." "Then keep riding." He glanced toward the wagon. The canvas snapped like a rifle shot in the wind. "Your baby won't last the night." Nora's jaw tightened. "I know what cold does. Then you know I'm telling the truth. I don't accept charity." Elias looked at Ruth's blue lips, at Caleb's soaked boots, at the baby making small, weak sounds under the coat. He could have argued. Instead he said, "Neither do I." Nora stared at him. He pointed toward the dark shape of his supply sled behind the horse. "I have blankets, hot stones under the tarp. Enough room for the children. And where would you take us?" "My ranch. What would you expect in return?" "Nothing tonight." Men who say that usually mean something tomorrow. A gust tore between them. Elias did not flinch. "Tomorrow," he said, "you can decide what kind of man I am." Nora's eyes remained hard, so Elias picked up the lantern, stepped back, and opened the side of the sled. Inside were 2 folded wool blankets, a sack of oats, a coil of rope, and a covered iron pot still warm from the line shack stove. The smell of beef broth drifted into the air. Caleb made a sound before he could stop himself. Nora heard it. That small sound broke the last wall Pride had built. "Why?" she asked. Elias looked toward the red mitten snapping above the drift. "Because somebody tied that high enough to be seen." Then he faced her again. "My door is open." Nora did not take his hand. She took the blankets. That was the first thing Elias respected about her. He wrapped Ruth and Caleb, placed Annie beside heated stones, and tied the freight wagon to the fence post so the storm would not carry it away. Nora climbed onto the back of the sled but kept Samuel's carpenter chest on her lap. They traveled for nearly 2 hours. The storm grew so thick that Elias could no longer see the horse's ears. He navigated by the slope beneath the runners, the sound of Cottonwood Creek to their left, and 6 iron bells he had hung years earlier along the final mile of fence. Lydia had called them foolish. Then, during one whiteout, those bells had guided her home. Elias had never taken them down. One by one they sounded through the dark, a thin ring, then another, then another. Each bell meant the cabin was closer. When they finally reached the ranch, the children saw an amber square of lamplight in a world made entirely of black and white. Elias carried Annie inside. Nora tried to walk on her own and nearly collapsed at the threshold. He caught her elbow. She pulled away. "I can stand. I know." The cabin was larger than she expected, built from dark pine logs with a stone hearth wide enough to roast a quarter of beef. The furniture was plain but carefully made. A woman's blue shawl still hung on a peg beside the bedroom door, untouched by dust. Elias filled bowls with stew. Nora fed the children first. Ruth ate too quickly and became sick. Nora cleaned the floor before Elias could reach for a rag. Caleb fell asleep with bread in his fist. Annie's crying grew stronger after she warmed, which was the first hopeful sound any of them had heard all day. Elias brought a mattress from the shuttered bunkhouse and laid it near the hearth. "You can use my room," he told Nora. "I'll sleep in the barn loft." "No. It's warmer. My children stay where I can see them." He nodded once, no argument, no pity. Before sleeping, Nora placed Samuel's carpenter chest beneath her head like a pillow. Elias noticed. He also noticed that she kept the hatchet within reach. By dawn, the storm had buried the lower windows. Elias woke to the smell of yeast bread. For a moment he thought Lydia was alive. The thought struck so hard he had to sit still on the edge of the hayloft until the memory passed. When he entered the cabin, Nora was kneading dough at the table. Ruth peeled potatoes. Caleb carried split wood 2 pieces at a time. Annie sat wrapped in a blanket near the hearth, banging a wooden spoon against a pan. "You used the last of my white flour," Elias said. Nora froze. "I'll replace it." "With what?" "Work. I didn't ask you to. You didn't have to." She turned the dough beneath her palms. "I can cook, sew, keep accounts, cure meat, set a broken finger, deliver a calf if it isn't turned wrong. Samuel taught me enough carpentry to repair a chair, a gate, or a roof brace. Ruth can read, Caleb can gather eggs and clean stalls. We won't eat what we haven't earned. Elias looked around. The floor had been swept. His torn work shirts sat in a neat pile, patched at the elbows. The kettle had been scrubbed. Even the dead clock on the mantel had been wound, though it still refused to tick. You did all this before sunrise? Nora met his eyes. You said I could decide what kind of man you were today. And I haven't decided. For the first time in months, Elias almost laughed. He took down 4 tin plates. Then eat while you're thinking. The pass remained closed for 11 days. During that time, Nora made herself impossible to call a guest. She reorganized the smokehouse after finding 2 sides of bacon beginning to spoil near a damp wall. She discovered that mice had chewed through a grain sack and stitched the hole shut with waxed thread. She repaired the hinge on the pantry door using a strip of leather from a ruined boot. She never entered Elias's bedroom. She never touched Lydia's shawl. She never asked what had happened. Her restraint did more than sympathy would have. Ruth read from an old newspaper each evening. Caleb followed Elias everywhere, asking questions without breathing between them. Why did cattle turn their backs to the wind? Why did horses sleep standing? Why did frozen creek ice sing at night? Elias answered the first 2. For the third, he said, because winter has a voice. Caleb considered that. Does it say anything good? Elias looked toward the hearth, where Nora was rocking Annie while Ruth sounded out a difficult word. Sometimes, he said, it tells you where home is. The children changed the cabin before anyone admitted it. Boots appeared beside the door in 4 sizes. A rag doll slept on the chair where Lydia once mended. Caleb hung a crooked horseshoe above the pantry because he said every ranch needed luck. Ruth placed pine sprigs in a chipped blue pitcher, and every morning Nora lit the lamp before dawn. The light shone from the eastern window toward the pass. Elias began calling it the Blue Lantern because Nora had wrapped the cracked glass chimney with a thin strip cut from her faded blue skirt to keep it from rattling. What for? He asked. So someone out there knows a house is awake. There won't be anyone on that road. There was us. Elias did not answer, but he left the lantern burning. On the 12th morning the clouds broke. Tomas Ortega arrived before noon on snowshoes, carrying news from the lower valley. 3 roofs had collapsed in Silver Junction. A schoolteacher named Miss Bell was missing. 2 miners from the Black Raven claim had failed to return from a supply run, and Barrett Kane, who owned the town's grain store, had begun charging twice the normal price for flour. Tomas stepped into the cabin, saw Nora and the children, then looked at Elias. You found a family. I found a broken wagon. Tomas smiled slightly. Sometimes those are the same thing. Nora introduced herself. Tomas removed his hat with formal courtesy. He was 42, born in northern New Mexico, and had worked cattle from Santa Fe to Wyoming. His wife, Isabel, was a midwife and healer. Their 3 sons worked beside him when school was out. Tomas listened as Elias explained the pass conditions. We should search for the teacher, Nora said. Elias shook his head. The slopes are unstable. Then search low ground. She may have gone east. Or she may be under a drift half a mile from this window. Elias's expression hardened. Nora did not look away. You brought us through the same storm. That was before the wind loaded the north face. Does danger become smaller when the missing person isn't standing in front of you? The room went quiet. Tomas studied the floor to hide a smile. Elias reached for his coat. We searched the creek route, he said. No higher than the cottonwoods. Nora was already wrapping bread in cloth. They found Miss Bell before sunset. She was alive inside an abandoned sheep shed, her ankle broken, her hands wrapped around an empty lantern. The 2 miners were with her. One had severe frostbite. The other was a Chinese immigrant named Li Wei, who had kept all 3 alive by burning the shed's broken door 1 plank at a time. Elias brought them to the ranch because there was nowhere else close enough. That Nora turned the silent cabin into a field hospital. She warmed Miss Bell slowly, not near the hottest part of the fire. She soaked the frostbitten man's feet in cool water first. She listened when Li Wei explained which finger still had feeling. She sent Caleb to boil rags, Ruth to count breaths, and Elias to bring the cleanest straw from the barn. You know what you're doing, Elias said. I know what panic ruins. By morning, every bed was taken. Elias slept in the barn again. Tomas rode home with a list of supplies. The blue lantern remained in the eastern window. 2 nights later, another shape appeared beyond it. A family from the mining camp had followed the light after their stovepipe collapsed. Then came an elderly trapper with pneumonia. Then a mail rider whose horse had gone lame. By the end of the week, 23 people were eating beneath Elias Mercer's roof or sleeping in the reopened bunkhouse. The ranch that had not welcomed a visitor in 6 years became the only warm station between Silver Junction and Mercy Pass. Elias hated crowds. He hated noise. He hated seeing strangers move through the rooms where Lydia and his daughter had once lived, but he hated turning away freezing people more. Nora understood the difference. She did not thank him in front of others. She simply made the impossible organized. She opened Samuel's old account book and created columns: name, skill, food used, work offered, need. The miners chopped wood. Miss Bell, with her ankles splinted, taught the children letters beside the fire. Li Wei repaired the stovepipe and built a drying rack from scrap iron. The trapper cleaned rabbits. Tomas's sons hauled water. No one ate without contributing something, even if that something was watching a baby while another person slept. Nora did not call it payment. She called it keeping dignity warm. For 7 days the system worked. Then Barrett Kane arrived. He came in a 2-horse sleigh wearing a fur coat too fine for the weather and anger too loud for the room. Behind him sat 4 sacks of flour. "I heard Mercer Ranch had become a charity hotel," he said. Elias stepped onto the porch. "State your business." "My business is grain. Your guests owe me for these sacks." "We didn't order them." "Tomas did." Tomas emerged from the barn. "I asked your clerk for flour at the regular winter price." Kane smiled. "My clerk doesn't set prices." He named a figure nearly 3 times what Nora had written in the ledger. Elias could pay it. Everyone knew that. He owned cattle, land, and a silver claim he had never worked. Kane expected him to reach into a strongbox and prove that mercy belonged only to rich men. Nora stepped forward. "We don't need your flour." Elias looked at her. The pantry held enough for perhaps 3 days. Kane laughed. "You planning to feed 20 people on snow?" "No," Nora said, "on what this valley already has." Kane's smile faded. She opened the ledger. "The Ortega family has cornmeal. Li Wei knows how to make noodles from buckwheat. Mr. Finch trapped 6 rabbits this morning. The schoolhouse has dried apples in its cellar. 3 ranches downstream have oats too old for horses but good enough for porridge if cleaned. The Black Raven cook owes these miners 2 weeks' provisions." Kane stared at her. Nora closed the book. "We need roads opened. Not a man selling fear by the sack." A few people behind her murmured. Kane's face darkened. "Be careful, widow. Pride starves children faster than winter." Nora's voice remained calm. "So does greed." Elias stepped beside her. For 1 second, Kane looked from the widow's worn dress to the rancher's unreadable face. Then he hauled the flour back onto his sleigh. "You'll come begging before the next storm." He left laughing. That night, Elias confronted Nora in the tack room. "You had no right to refuse food on my property. You had no right to rescue us and then make yourself the only person allowed to decide what mercy costs." His eyes narrowed. "I can afford flour." That wasn't his price. It was money. It was obedience. Wind pushed against the barn walls. Horses shifted in their stalls. Elias lowered his voice. "There are children in that cabin. I know every spoonful they have eaten. And if your plan fails, then blame me." That is not an answer. Nora gripped the ledger against her chest. "No, it is the answer you've been using for 6 years." The words struck him silent. She regretted them immediately. But she did not take them back. Elias turned away. Nora saw his hand rest on the stall door, knuckles pale. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "I buried my wife and daughter in the same frozen ground." Nora said nothing. "I had men here then, neighbors, a preacher. People bringing pies and prayers and asking what they could do. Every one of them left. The room stayed." He looked toward the wall as if he could see through it into the cabin. "You think I closed the bunkhouse because I hated people?" "No. I closed it because every open door sounded like someone leaving." Nora's anger softened, but her answer did not. "A closed door doesn't keep grief out, Mr. Mercer. It only keeps grief from learning any new names." Elias looked at her. For the first time, she saw the lonely man beneath the hard one. Then a bell rang outside, not one of the fence bells, the warning bell beside the cattle yard. Tomas burst through the door. Creek ice broke upstream. The temperature had risen too quickly during the afternoon, loosening a shelf of snow above Cottonwood Creek. Water and ice slammed into the lower pasture, tore through the fence, and scattered 40 head of cattle toward the ravine. Every able person ran. The night filled with shouting, snapping rope, and the terrified bawl of livestock. Elias mounted before anyone could stop him. Tomas rode left. Li Wei and the miners formed a line with lanterns to turn the herd. Nora remained near the barn with the children and injured travelers, keeping the gate clear. Then the ground beneath Elias's horse collapsed. Horse and rider vanished into a cut filled with rushing black water. Nora heard Tomas shout his name. She grabbed a coil of rope. The current had pinned Elias against a cottonwood trunk. One leg was trapped beneath the horse. Water climbed to his chest. Tomas tried to reach him from the far bank, but the ice broke under his boots. "Rope!" Nora shouted. Leeway tied one end around a fence anchor. Nora crawled onto the frozen edge, inch by inch, while Ruth held the lantern behind her. Elias saw her coming. "Go back," Nora kept moving. "The bank is breaking. I heard you. Your children need you. So does this valley." She threw the rope. It fell short. She pulled it back, wrapped the line around her forearm, and crawled farther until freezing water soaked her dress to the waist. The second throw reached him. Elias caught it. Together 8 people pulled. The horse came free first, then Elias. When they dragged him onto solid ground, his left leg bent wrong below the knee. The cattle were still loose. The creek was still rising, and the storm Kane had predicted began before dawn. This time it was worse. Snow came sideways. The road disappeared within an hour. Elias lay feverish in the cabin while Isabel Ortega set the broken leg and warned that infection could take him if the swelling did not ease. The pantry held less food than Nora had hoped. 2 barrels of oats were moldy at the bottom. The dried beans would last 4 days. The salt pork maybe 5. 23 people were already sheltered at the ranch. Then just after noon, Caleb saw movement beyond the blue lantern. 11 more people were coming through the storm. A wagon from the South mining camp had overturned near the creek. Among them were 3 children, a pregnant woman, and Barrett Kane's young clerk, who had been sent to collect debts before the road closed. The bunkhouse was full. The firewood stack had fallen beneath drifting snow. Elias, half-conscious with fever, heard the voices on the porch. "No more," he said. Nora leaned close. "What?" "We can't save everyone." The words were honest. That made them heavier. Nora looked around the cabin. At Miss Bell sleeping upright because every bed was taken. At Lee Way tearing old blankets into bandages. At Ruth feeding Annie watered milk. At Caleb, standing by the window watching the shapes outside grow weaker. Nora thought of the freight wagon, the red mitten, the hot stones beneath the sled tarp. 4 words offered by a man who had every reason to keep riding. She opened the door. Snow blew across the floor. Behind her, Elias struggled to sit up. "Nora," she turned. "If we close it now," she said, "then this was only luck. I want it to mean more than that." She brought them inside. That decision nearly broke the ranch. For 2 days, 34 people survived on thin oat porridge, rabbit broth, dried apples, and whatever milk the cows still gave. Nora reduced every portion equally. She ate last. Then she stopped eating at all. Ruth noticed. So did Elias. From his bed, he watched Nora move between the hearth, the sick room, the barn, and the ledger table until her face lost color. On the 3rd night, she collapsed while carrying water. Elias tried to rise and fell against the bed frame. Tomas caught him. "You cannot walk." "Then carry me." "Where?" "To the table." They brought Elias into the main room and set him in a chair. 34 people turned toward him. For years, Elias Mercer had avoided speaking to more than 2 people at once. Now he looked at miners, ranch hands, children, widows, immigrants, a teacher, a trapper, and the trembling clerk who worked for the man trying to profit from their fear. He saw Nora unconscious near the hearth. Then he saw the blue lantern burning in the window. Its flame was low. The oil was nearly gone. Elias placed both hands on the table. "My wife used to say a ranch is not measured by the fence around it," he began. His voice shook. "She said it is measured by what the fence protects." He swallowed. "I thought closing my gate protected what I had left." Outside, wind struck the cabin like a hammer. I was wrong. He looked at each person in the room. "We have food for 1 day if we wait to be rescued. No one moved. We have longer if we rescue ourselves." Then he began giving orders, not as a wealthy landowner, as a rancher who finally understood that people were not another kind of loss. The miners dug out the buried woodpile. Tomas and his sons slaughtered 1 injured steer that would not survive the winter. Leeway converted the wash boiler into a steam pot and stretched cornmeal into dumplings. Miss Bell organized the children to twist straw into fuel bundles. The trapper led 2 men to the rabbit runs at dawn. The pregnant woman, Sarah Pike, knew how to render tallow and made candles when the lamp oil ran low. Kane's clerk confessed that the grain store warehouse had 600 pounds of flour hidden behind a false partition so prices would continue rising. The room changed. People looked at one another. Not with hunger now, with anger. The clerk lowered his head. He told me no one would challenge him while the road was closed. Elias looked at Nora's ledger. Then the road does not need to open first. He asked Ruth to bring Samuel Hale's carpenter square from the wooden chest. Everyone watched as Elias placed it across the account book. Straight lines, he said, are built before walls stand. He dictated a notice. Every ranch, mine, and household represented at Mercer Ranch would record what supplies they had, what labor they could give, and what they needed. No hoarding, no winter price increases, no family turned away from shelter during a storm. Debts for emergency food would be repaid in work, goods, or later harvest, never at crushing interest. Miss Bell wrote each word. Tomas and Leeway signed first, then the miners, then the trapper, then Sarah Pike. Even Kane's clerk signed. Elias could not travel, so 2 of the strongest men carried the notice through the storm on snowshoes to the lower farms. They followed the fence bells. At every house they asked for one thing in return: hang a blue lantern where travelers can see it. If you have shelter, light it. If you need help, place it low in the window. By the next evening, 3 blue lights appeared along Cottonwood Creek. Then 6, then 11. People began moving supplies from one light to the next. A dairy widow sent milk uphill. A sheep ranch sent wool blankets. The schoolhouse cellar opened its dried apples. A blacksmith repaired sled runners without charging cash. Families who had never spoken except at funerals began carrying food through the storm. Barrett Kane tried to stop them. He locked his warehouse. But the clerk had the key. When townspeople opened the false partition and found the hidden flour, no one stole it. They weighed it, recorded it, paid the regular price into a sealed box, then distributed it according to Nora's ledger. That mattered. The valley did not answer greed with lawlessness. It answered greed with proof. By the time Kane reached the warehouse, 20 witnesses were standing beside the scales. Miss Bell read the notice aloud. Kane called it theft. Tomas pointed to the payment box. Leeway pointed to the records. The blacksmith pointed to 3 starving children waiting outside. And old Sheriff Amos Reed, who had spent 2 days trapped at the south end of town, arrived in time to say, "A man can own flour. He cannot own a blizzard." Kane never regained the power fear had given him. The storm lasted 9 days. No one in Mercy Valley froze to death. Not one child went without a meal for more than 12 hours. 6 roofs collapsed, but every family found shelter beneath a blue lantern. 14 miles of trail were marked by bells, rope lines, or pine boughs, and at Mercer Ranch, 34 strangers became something no one had planned. A community. Nora woke after a day and a half. The first thing she saw was Elias sitting beside the hearth, his broken leg raised on a stool, holding Annie with the terrified concentration of a man handling dynamite. The baby had fallen asleep against his chest. "You look frightened," Nora whispered. Elias glanced down. "She has your temper. Then you should be." His laugh startled everyone in the room. It was the first time most of them had heard it. Nora tried to rise. Elias pointed at the mattress. "No, I have work. So do 33 other people." 34. He looked at her. "You are not counted as labor today. I won't accept charity. It isn't charity." He nodded toward the blue lantern. "It is tomorrow." Nora understood the words. They were not his. Not anymore. They belonged to everyone who had carried them forward. When the storm finally broke, the valley looked remade. Snow covered the damage, but not the evidence. Sled tracks crossed between homes that had once ignored one another. Blue lanterns glowed in windows from Silver Junction to the North Pasture. At every stop, someone had written numbers in a book. Flour given, wood cut, medicines shared, hours worked, children sheltered. No one knew what to call the system. Ruth called it the open-door ledger. The names stayed. Spring came late. When the thaw began, it brought a new danger. The creek swelled with mountain runoff and threatened the only bridge connecting Silver Junction to the eastern ranches. Before the winter, the town would have waited for the county. The county would have sent a letter. The letter would have arrived after the bridge was gone. This time, the Blue Lantern Network moved first. Tomas rode the lower road. Leeway organized timber crews. Samuel Hale's carpenter square was used to mark replacement braces. Miss Bell turned the schoolhouse into a meal station. Women boiled coffee and bandaged hands. Teenagers hauled nails. Miners rigged cable from an abandoned ore tram. Elias, still walking with a cane, supervised from the bank. Nora stood beside him with the ledger. For 30 hours the valley worked. The bridge held. That was when people understood the winter had changed more than their opinion of one ranch. It had changed what they believed neighbors were for. At the first spring meeting, The townspeople gathered inside the freight depot. There were no flowers, no polished speeches. Working people had come directly from fields, kitchens, stables, and claims. Mud dried on their boots. The blue lantern from Mercer Ranch sat on a crate near the front. Its glass was still wrapped with the strip from Nora's skirt. Sheriff Reed asked Elias to speak. He refused. They asked Nora. She refused too. So Ruth Hale, 10 years old and serious as a judge, opened the ledger and read the first page. Name, skill, food used, work offered, need. Then she read the winter totals. 186 meals shared outside immediate families. 42 blankets moved between homes, 17 stranded travelers sheltered, 9 injured people cared for, 3 babies delivered with help from women who followed blue lanterns through storms. No deaths from exposure, no emergency debt charged interest. When Ruth finished, the depot remained silent. The numbers were not grand, they were not the kind printed in newspapers. But every number had a face standing in the room. Elias looked at Nora. He had once believed wealth was what allowed a man to survive without asking anyone for help. Now he understood that was only another form of poverty. Barrett Kane stood near the back. His store was still open, but the valley had formed a supply cooperative. He could charge fair prices or watch business pass him by. He did not apologize. Men like Kane rarely did. But he stopped hiding flour. Sometimes a community does not change a cruel heart. It simply makes cruelty less profitable. The town voted to keep the open-door ledger. Every winter, each household would mark what shelter, food, animals, tools, or skills it could share. Blue lanterns would remain the signal. High in the window meant help could be given. Low in the window meant help was needed. No shame attached to either one. That was Nora's rule. Years later, children born after the Great Storm would assume the lantern custom had always existed. Travelers wrote about it. A blue light at a ranch gate meant coffee, a place near the stove, and a name entered into the ledger rather than a debt book. The custom spread beyond Mercy Valley to mining camps and stage stations farther west, not everywhere. Kindness rarely conquers the whole world at once. It takes one road, one house, one decision, then another. Nora and her children remained at Mercer Ranch through the summer. At first she called it an arrangement. She kept the books, managed the garden, oversaw repairs, turned the old bunkhouse into a winter shelter with 12 narrow beds and hooks for wet coats. Ruth studied under Miss Bell and later became the valley's first full-time teacher. Caleb learned cattle from Tomas and carpentry from the tools in his father's chest. Annie grew up believing Elias had always been there. He did not correct her. One evening in September, Nora found Elias rehanging Lydia's blue shawl. He had moved it from the peg beside the bedroom door to a cedar chest. "I should have done that years ago," he said. Nora stood quietly. "I kept it there because moving it felt like betrayal. And now leaving it there feels like asking the dead to guard an empty room." He closed the chest. Then he handed Nora a paper. It was a partnership agreement, half the winter shelter, half the garden income, a wage for managing the ranch accounts, ownership shares set aside for Ruth, Caleb, and Annie if they stayed and worked the land when grown. Nora read every line. "You wrote this?" Miss Bell helped. "I won't take half your ranch. I didn't offer half." The corner of his mouth moved. "I offered fair terms. You taught me the difference." Nora folded the paper. "What happens if I leave?" Elias looked toward the eastern window. The blue lantern burned there, although the night was clear. "The door stays open." It was the right answer. That was why she stayed. They married the following spring in the freight depot where Ruth had read the ledger. There was no silk dress, no expensive ring. Tomas stood beside Elias. Miss Bell stood beside Nora. Lee Way built the wedding arch from salvaged bridge timber. The valley brought food. Barrett Kane sent nothing. No one missed it after the ceremony. Elias and Nora walked home with the children along Cottonwood Creek. Blue lanterns appeared one by one as dusk settled, at the Ortega house, at the school, at the blacksmith shop, at the widow's dairy, at the miner's road. Each light answered the next. Elias stopped where the old fence crossed the trail, the same fence line where he had once found a red mitten above a broken wagon. The mitten was gone. The storm had taken it months before. But he could still see it. A small piece of color against all that white, a warning, a plea, a brave little flag raised by a woman who refused to let winter erase her children. "I thought I was bringing you to safety that night," he said. Nora slipped her hand into his. "You were." He shook his head. "I was bringing safety home." They stood there while the last light left the mountains. Behind them the ranch windows glowed. Ahead, blue lanterns marked the valley road. Winter had once closed every path through Mercy Pass. One open door taught the valley how to open all the rest.